am Sophie Bjork-James, an assistant professor of anthropology at Vanderbilt University, and my pronouns are she, her. The core questions I want to focus on are, why do people care about what they care about, and how does that end up happening on the group level, and what are the impacts of that? So, for example, for my dissertation research that led to my first book, The Divine Institution, White Evangelicalism's Politics of the Family, I was really curious about what allowed white evangelicals to end up coming from many different individual experiences, many different kinds of churches, form like a very significant agreement around politics. So white evangelicals since the early 1980s have been pretty much the largest voting bloc in the United States. I think it's a really helpful way to investigate many different kinds of political positions, ones that we agree with, but also ones that we don't. So personally, I'm a mom. I've had 2 children that I've carried and birthed. And I really think that reproduction is sacred, whether or not we choose to have children or not, right? That it's like a sacred, it's sacred in that it stands out from the rest of our lives. It's like a crucial part of our identities. And in the United States, it's often also an experience, a central place where people experience trauma, is around whether or not they can control their own reproductive lives. But for me, like, I really want to, I'm very interested in this question about why abortion is so often remains the focus of our political debates, when right in the United States, we have extremely high rates of maternal and infant mortality, but I see those as really the tip of the iceberg for so many other forms of trauma that happen when people are pregnant and have children. And so for me, reproduction is sacred. It's, a central part of who we are as people, and whether or not we have autonomy over our reproductive lives shapes so many other things. It makes our identity. It shapes our identities in so many different ways. And when people experience trauma around their reproductive health, then that can have implications in many different directions, right? Including for people who get pregnant by choice, who have children by choice, but often sites of birth are sites of trauma. And so I often ask this question about when there's so many different aspects around reproduction that are so deeply problematic in the United States, yet the only real form of reproductive politics that end up shaping policy is abortion. Let me talk also about where I live, which is in Tennessee, which as of August 25th of 2022 has implemented a complete abortion ban where there's 0 exceptions. And so there's very significant impacts in terms of people who want an elective abortion. But what's also happened in Tennessee is that that decision has made pregnancy like far more dangerous for women or for people with uteruses. It's and it's radically changed the practice of medicine. I think that what abortion is often talked about as a black and white issue of you're either pro-life or you're pro-choice. There's always the third aspect of people with pregnancies that are unwanted. But I also think what I'm finding with some of the more recent research I'm doing and interviewing medical providers who treat women in Tennessee right now is that they describe themselves as practicing medicine with their hands tied, in that their women's health cannot be a priority if there is a fetal heartbeat. So if someone is pregnant and facing a life life-threatening condition, their medical providers can no longer prioritize the health of the mother, because if it requires giving that mother an abortion, because giving that person an abortion, because the law is now intervening between the patient and provider relationship. If someone provides an abortion that isn't about directly saving the mother's life, then they're going to be faced with felony charges. They likely lose their license, multiple years in prison, huge fines, and so providers are adding there's a very different calculation around treating women whose pregnancies are threatening their lives and their health. But I think so again, like, to kind of step back, right? These issues are so complicated and complex, and yet in policy, they're often talked about in very black and white terms. As an anthropologist who studies the US, I really find it so helpful to be comparing what happens in the United States to what happens elsewhere. Often US perspectives are very US bounded by kind of consciousness of the US and like US exceptionalism. So we think about in the United States that we had this period between 1973 and 2022 where abortion was a guaranteed right, guaranteed by the Supreme Court. But the many other parts of the world did not have never had legal access to abortion, and so I think it's helpful to learn from other places that have different that have had abortion bans and how that impacts people. But I think it's just helpful to think about the different ways that reproduction is related to state power. And for me, it's been beneficial in having conversations with scholars and experts from countries all over the world to think more comparatively about how reproduction is controlled, and to think about the different ways that states can actually encourage more reproductive justice or limit it. In my research on the pro-life movement, I think that they really define the state as righteous in relationship to reproductive politics, specifically opposing abortion. And so I look at how politicians describe this. I look at how religious leaders talk about this, but that the kind of morality of the state is based on limiting access to abortion. And that has become kind of a very central way that the state is seen as righteous or good or moral. And that becomes an imperative, a political imperative then for the state to regulate abortion and criminalize it, or make it illegal. And I think for me, this framework is very helpful because it shows not that it's, I think in terms of how we think about abortion politics, we often think of you're either pro-life or you're pro-choice. And yet, and then we have cynical ways which we see people who believe in what we don't believe in. But I think what reproductive righteousness shows is kind of the moral work that goes in. And by moral, I don't mean like this is from an anthropological perspective in terms of how people decide what is good versus bad, as opposed to not a commentary on like what is good or bad, but really about how people decide what is good or bad. This framework helps us see that how abortion and banning abortion becomes kind of the most righteous, most moral issue for a state to focus on. And so what I look at too is like, what does that, by focusing on banning abortion as the central focus of the state, what other issues become seen as less or insignificant, right? And so what my article is comparing is looking at the ways that defining the state as righteous through abortion bans also allows for a kind of ignorance of the harms that come from various forms of environmental pollution, everything from climate change to air pollution, which one could also see if we have a more holistic idea about reproduction. Air pollution harms fetuses and children. There's all these studies that show that exposure to air pollution leads to more preterm births. That every form of environmental harm is also a reproductive issue in that it impacts children, right? That the studies have shown that in the last few years, a significant number of children in the United States, but also in the world, have experienced dramatic weather events, which can lead to emotional trauma, physical trauma, et cetera. And that's only going to be increasing. And yet, what I find in terms of the kind of conservative movements that define the state as righteous through abortion bans, that they end up allowing for all of the other kinds of environmental harms that also affect reproduction to continue, and even endorse them because they're seen as insignificant as compared to this kind of primary moral harm of abortion. So I think it's a really helpful framework for kind of mapping out how these different issues come together in different kinds of political contexts.